My wife Jessica and I had been married for 8 years. Good marriage, or so I thought. She worked at this marketing firm downtown, always talking about her boss Brandon. Brandon thinks this, Brandon said that. I didn't think much of it until I noticed she started working late more often. Coming home with this glow, you know. Like she had some secret. The breaking point came 3 months ago. I decided to surprise her at work with dinner. Walked into that fancy office building, took the elevator to the 15th floor. The receptionist wasn't there, so I just walked back to Jessica's office. The door was cracked open, and I heard laughing. Not just any laughing, intimate laughing. I pushed the door open and there they were. Jessica sitting on Brandon's desk, him standing between her legs, hands on her waist. They weren't kissing or anything, but the way they looked at each other, man, it hit me like a truck. 8 years of marriage, and she's looking at another man like that. They saw me and jumped apart. Jessica's face went white. Brandon straightened his tie like nothing happened. "Oh hey honey," Jessica stammered. Brandon was just showing me this new campaign strategy. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring. Then I said, "Yeah, looks like a real hands-on approach." Turned around and walked out. Didn't say another word. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking, heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Got to my car and just sat there in the parking garage for probably 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. The way they looked at each other, that wasn't just professional mentoring or friendly conversation. That was intimacy I hadn't seen in my own marriage for months. I drove home in a daze, replaying the scene over and over. The worst part wasn't even catching them, it was the realization that I'd been blind to it for who knows how long. All those late nights, all those stories about Brandon, all those times she came home glowing with excitement about work. How could I have been so stupid? That night was hell. Jessica kept trying to explain, saying it wasn't what it looked like. But I knew. 20 years of being with someone, you know when they're lying. She swore nothing physical happened, but the emotional betrayal. That cut deeper than anything physical could have. I couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Took a few days off work, told my boss I had the flu. Spent those days just driving around, trying to figure out what to do. Divorce seemed obvious, but something inside me wanted them to feel what I felt. That crushing disappointment, that betrayal. That's when I remembered something Jessica mentioned months ago. Brandon was up for this huge promotion, regional director position. Company was doing background checks, interviewing people, the whole 9 yards. She'd mentioned how stressed he was about it, how this promotion would set him up for life. I also remembered Jessica telling me about some questionable stuff at their office. Nothing illegal, but definitely against company policy. She'd laughed about how Brandon would expense personal dinners, how he'd use company resources for side projects. Little things that individually meant nothing, but together. Well, that could be interesting. See, I work in IT. Network security, to be specific. I know how to find information, how to trace digital footprints. I'd never used those skills for personal reasons before, but desperate times and all that. I started digging. Public records, social media, professional networks. Amazing what you can find about someone when you really look. Brandon wasn't as careful as he thought he was. First thing I found was his spending habits. Guy was living way beyond what his salary should allow. Expensive watches, designer clothes, fancy car payments. Made me wonder where all that money was coming from. Then I started looking at his social media more carefully. Pictures from expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, high-end golf courses. All time-stamped during business hours. I created a fake LinkedIn profile and started connecting with people at their company. Amazing how much office gossip you can pick up when people think you're a potential business partner. Found out Brandon had a reputation for being a little too friendly with female employees, that there had been whispers about expense account abuse, that some people questioned how he afforded his lifestyle. The more I dug, the clearer it became that Brandon had been playing fast and loose with company resources for years. And my wife had been getting swept up in his world of expensive lunches and questionable business trips. The plan started simple. I found Brandon's LinkedIn profile, his company email format, even his personal social media accounts. Guy was careless with his privacy settings. I could see his check-ins at expensive restaurants during work hours, photos from what looked like business trips that seemed more like vacations. But then I found something bigger. Brandon had been involved in this charity event the company sponsored. Raised money for local schools, big PR thing. Looking at the financial records, which were public, thank God for transparency laws, something didn't add up. The money raised versus what actually got donated, there was a gap. I spent weeks documenting everything. Screenshots, financial records, timeline of events. Wasn't trying to frame him for anything that wasn't true, just putting together pieces that were already there. Meanwhile, Jessica kept trying to fix things at home. Making my favorite meals, suggesting date nights, being extra affectionate. It felt hollow. Every time she touched me, I wondered if she was thinking about him. Every late night at work made me suspicious. The worst part? I still loved her. That's what made this so hard. If I didn't care, walking away would have been easy. But 8 years of shared dreams, inside jokes, morning coffee together, you don't just throw that away without trying something. So I decided to send an anonymous tip to their company's ethics hotline. Just the facts, with documentation. Figured they'd investigate, maybe Brandon would get a slap on the wrist, lose the promotion. Small revenge, but satisfying. I had no idea what I was actually setting in motion. I spent hours crafting that anonymous report. Made sure everything was factual, nothing could be traced back to me. Included screenshots of his social media posts showing expensive purchases during work hours, copies of public records showing his financial situation, even some of the charity event documents that showed the discrepancies. The hardest part was not including anything about Jessica. I was angry at her, sure, but she wasn't the one embezzling money or abusing company resources. She was just, caught up in his charm, I guess. Part of me still wanted to protect her, even after what she'd done to our marriage. I submitted the report on a Tuesday night after Jessica had gone to bed. Hit send and immediately felt this mix of satisfaction and terror. There was no taking it back now. The investigation started quietly. I only knew because Jessica came home stressed one day, mentioning that HR was asking questions about expense reports and company events. She seemed worried but didn't know why I was asking so many questions about it. 2 weeks later, everything exploded. Brandon got called into a meeting with corporate. Turns out, my little tip triggered a full audit of his department. They found way more than I expected, not just the charity thing, but a pattern of financial irregularities going back years. Jessica called me at work, crying. Brandon had been suspended pending investigation. The promotion was obviously off the table. But here's where it gets crazy, because Brandon was her direct supervisor, Jessica got pulled into the investigation too. See, Brandon had been signing off on Jessica's expense reports, some of which were apparently questionable. Business lunches that looked personal, conference expenses that didn't match up with actual conferences. Jessica swore she didn't know anything was wrong, that Brandon told her everything was approved. I felt this sick satisfaction watching her panic. Finally, she was feeling some of what I felt. But then the guilt hit me. This wasn't just about Brandon anymore, I was watching my wife's career implode. The investigation kept expanding. Corporate brought in external auditors, forensic accountants, the works. What started as a simple ethics violation was turning into potential embezzlement charges. The local news picked up the story because of the charity connection. Jessica wasn't sleeping, barely eating. She'd sit at the kitchen table with legal documents, trying to prove her innocence. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but another part thought she deserved this stress after what she put me through. The investigation kept expanding like a cancer. What started with Brandon's department spread to other divisions. Turns out his schemes were more sophisticated than anyone realized. He'd been creating fake vendors, submitting inflated invoices, even skimming money from client payments. The guy was basically running a one-man crime syndicate inside a legitimate business. Jessica hired a lawyer with money we didn't really have. Our savings account was draining fast, and now she wasn't bringing in any income. I watched her stress levels skyrocket as she tried to prove she had no knowledge of Brandon's crimes. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the one who'd started this avalanche, and now I had to watch it bury my own wife. The worst part was how scared she looked. This confident, successful woman I'd married was reduced to jumping every time the phone rang, convinced the police were coming for her next. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Jessica answered, and I heard her gasp. Brandon had been arrested. Not just fired, actually arrested on embezzlement charges. Turns out he'd been stealing from multiple company accounts for years, covering it up with fake invoices and inflated expense reports. Jessica was cleared of criminal wrongdoing, but the company decided to let her go anyway. Restructuring, they called it, but we both knew the truth. She was collateral damage from my revenge. That night, she broke down completely. Told me everything. Yes, she'd developed feelings for Brandon. Yes, they'd gotten close emotionally. But she swore nothing physical ever happened, and now she felt like an idiot for risking our marriage over someone who turned out to be a criminal. I sat there listening to her sob, feeling this weird mix of vindication and horror. I'd wanted them to suffer, but this was way beyond what I'd planned. Brandon was facing serious jail time. Jessica's reputation in her industry was destroyed. And somehow, I felt responsible for all of it. The crazy part? Jessica started leaning on me for support. With Brandon gone and her job lost, I was all she had left. We started talking more honestly than we had in years. About our marriage, about what went wrong, about whether we could fix it. I wanted to tell her what I'd done, but how do you admit you're responsible for destroying someone's life? Even someone who betrayed you. Brandon's case made the local business journal. Marketing executive charged with embezzling $200,000. His mugshot was right there on page 1. I felt sick looking at it. The article went into detail about his schemes, how he'd been stealing for years, how the investigation started with an anonymous tip. Reading it felt surreal, seeing the consequences of my actions laid out in black and white newsprint. They quoted the prosecutor saying it was one of the most elaborate embezzlement cases they'd seen in years. Jessica read the article too, shaking her head in disbelief. I can't believe I worked for this man for 3 years and never suspected anything, she said. I feel so stupid. How did I not see the signs? I almost choked on my coffee. If only she knew that her husband was the one who'd connected all those dots, who'd brought down the man she'd been emotionally involved with. The guilt was becoming unbearable, but I couldn't figure out how to confess without destroying what little trust we'd managed to rebuild. 6 months later, Brandon pled guilty. Got 3 years in prison and had to pay full restitution. His wife divorced him, took the kids and moved across the country. Guy went from successful executive to convicted felon because I couldn't handle seeing my wife laugh with another man. Jessica struggled to find work. Her name was connected to the scandal, and the marketing world is smaller than you'd think. She eventually took a job at a much smaller firm for half her previous salary. We had to sell the house, move into a smaller apartment. But here's the weird part, our marriage actually got stronger. Going through that crisis together, supporting each other when everything fell apart, it brought us closer than we'd been in years. Jessica never knew I was behind it all, but the guilt was eating me alive. One night, after a few drinks, I almost told her. We were talking about Brandon, about how crazy it was that he turned out to be a thief. Jessica said, I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd actually gotten involved with him. I could have gone to prison too. That stopped me cold. I'd been so focused on my hurt feelings that I never considered she could have faced criminal charges. What if she'd been more involved in his schemes? What if my revenge had sent my own wife to prison? I started having panic attacks, couldn't concentrate at work. The weight of what I'd done was crushing me. I'd wanted justice, but this felt more like destruction. Jessica noticed my anxiety and insisted I see a therapist. Ironic, right? She was trying to help me deal with the guilt of destroying her life. The therapist, Dr. Martinez, was this kind older woman who specialized in trauma and relationship issues. I told her about discovering Jessica's emotional affair, about the stress of almost losing my marriage, about the guilt I felt watching her struggle to rebuild her career. All true, just not the complete truth. Betrayal trauma is real, she explained during one session. When someone we trust breaks that trust, it can trigger all kinds of responses. Anger, desire for revenge, guilt about those feelings, it's all normal. Normal. If only she knew how far I'd taken those normal feelings. I wanted to tell her everything, but how do you admit to a mental health professional that you systematically destroyed someone's life? That you used your technical skills to ruin multiple families because you couldn't handle your emotions like a grown man? Instead, I just nodded and talked about forgiveness and moving forward, all while carrying this massive secret that was eating me alive from the inside. It's been a year now since everything went down. Brandon's in prison, Jessica's slowly rebuilding her career, and I'm still carrying this secret. Some days I think about confessing everything. Other days I convince myself it was justified, they betrayed me first. The therapist says guilt is a normal response to trauma, that discovering infidelity can trigger all kinds of emotional reactions. If only she knew the real source of my guilt. Jessica and I are doing better than we have in years. We go to couples counseling, we communicate more openly, we actually spend time together instead of just existing in the same house. It's like the crisis forced us to remember why we fell in love in the first place. But there's this shadow over everything. Every time Jessica mentions how unfair it was that she lost her job, every time she talks about Brandon's poor family, I feel this crushing weight. I single-handedly destroyed multiple lives because I couldn't handle my emotions like an adult. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just confronted them directly, or filed for divorce, or gone to marriage counseling first. Would Jessica have chosen me? Would we have worked things out without all this destruction? I'll never know, because I chose revenge instead. And now I have to live with the consequences of that choice forever. The worst part? I got what I wanted. Brandon's life is ruined, Jessica learned her lesson about emotional affairs, and our marriage is stronger than ever. But the cost was so much higher than I ever imagined. If you're reading this and thinking about revenge, don't. Just don't. There are always unintended consequences, and you might not be able to live with yourself afterward. Some victories aren't worth winning. I got my revenge, sure. Brandon's in prison, his family destroyed, his career obliterated. Jessica learned the hard way about the dangers of emotional infidelity. Our marriage survived and even thrived. But I wake up every morning knowing I'm responsible for sending a man to prison, for destroying his children's lives, for traumatizing my own wife in ways she'll never fully understand. The anonymous tip line is still active at Jessica's old company. Sometimes I wonder if they ever figured out who made that call, if there's some investigation file sitting in HR with my digital fingerprints all over it. But it's been a year, and nobody's come knocking. Maybe I'll tell Jessica someday. Maybe I'll take this secret to my grave. All I know is that revenge isn't the justice I thought it would be. It's just another kind of prison, and I'm serving a life sentence.